Hi, I'm Richard Vague of Tycos, and this week we're going to be talking about the miracle in Spain. Last week we looked at the adverse population trends in Spain and how it had resorted to pro-immigration policies to counter those. Now let's look at how that has played out in its economy. The thing to note is in the lead up to the global financial crisis, Spain, at least economically, misbehaved more than any other country in the world in relation to its size. To review, we now know that in the US, Spain, and many other countries, they were wildly profligate in the number of real estate loans made, resulting in thousands and then millions of empty houses around the globe, huge numbers of unpaid defaulted mortgage loans and loans to builders and developers, all of which brought bank failures, massive unemployment, and, you know the story. In the U.S., mortgage loans increased from $5 trillion to $10 trillion in 5 short years, taking the total from 149% of GDP to 174% of GDP from 2003 to 2008. They were consequence of this ridiculous real estate lending excess. But, believe it or not, the overbuilding and overlending in Spain made the U.S. misbehavior look mild in comparison on a relative basis. While our private debt ratio went from 149 to 174, Spain's in that same time span went from 143 to 214, bringing catastrophe to its economy. Of course, as that was happening, Spain's elected officials concluded they were geniuses since the economy was growing rapidly, albeit artificially based on ill-advised loans. Unemployment was disappearing, and surprise, government debt was going down in ratio to GDP. Unbeknownst to them, that's what almost always happens in a boom. Earnings go up, businesses pay higher taxes, GDP rises fast, and thus the government debt ratio gets better. Then, of course, Spain and the rest of the world figured out there weren't nearly enough buyers for all these homes, and it all came tumbling down. You can see in this same chart that in Spain as elsewhere, the government had to rush in to prop things up through its spending, so the ratio of government to GDP started climbing back up out of the crisis, and the private debt ratio flattened as lenders stopped lending, as loans were called, and as bad loans were charged off. Of course, these trends were also bad in France, Germany, Greece, and many other countries. The interesting thing to note is, since those dark financial crisis days, in France, these high debt ratios have actually gotten worse. In Germany, the private debt ratio has barely budged. It's certainly not gotten better. And even in most countries where they got better, it was not by all that much. But in Spain, things have gotten much better. The private debt ratio has gone from 225 down to 122%. And the government debt ratio has gone from 125% to 102%. Just how did that miracle happen? First, since Spain had a population decline after the GFC, which of course was accompanied by low levels of economic growth, it very intentionally developed a policy to attract workers from Latin America to bolster its workforce, and it paid off with restored strong population growth, which translated into economic growth. Remember that GDP is largely just a measure of spending, and the more people you have, the more generally gets spent. The fact that these immigrants were Spanish-speaking and steeped in Spanish culture helped minimize the always difficult issues of integrating them into a new country. Secondly, Spain made a concerted effort to build up its export capability, transforming itself from a net importer to a net exporter of as much as 4% of GDP, which is a highly advantageous position. Much of this happened in manufacturing, but it was a broad success across multiple sectors. And here's the thing. whereas non-export related growth, in essence domestic growth, essentially always requires increased domestic debt. For example, the financing it takes to build a new factory or new home. Net exports bring economic growth without the need for increased domestic debt, thus naturally improving the private debt to GDP ratio. Here's the math. If your GDP is 100 million and you already have 100 million in aggregate private debt, your private debt ratio is 100%. If you build a factory for 10 million and incur 10 million in debt to do that, your GDP is now 110 million and your debt is also now 110 million. So your private debt ratio is still 100%. But if instead you grow your economy by 10 million in exports, by a net export position that increases by 10 million, your GDP grows to 110 million, but it is the other country that is incurring the debt in that case. So your country's outstanding private debt remains at $100 million, and thus your private debt ratio improves or is reduced to 91%. The third thing Spain did was to reduce its debt ratios was to simply not let debt grow much faster than GDP, which if your ratio is above 100%, automatically reduces the ratio. This is a very little known, little understood factor in debt ratios. Here's how it happens. Remember, Spain's private debt ratio was over 200%. So let's take this hypothetical case where a country's GDP is $100 million and its private debt is $200 million, so its private debt ratio is 200%. Let's then say that it grows both GDP and debt by $20 million. So GDP is now $120 million and debt is $220 million. The result is private debt ratio that is no longer 200%. It is only 183%. Voila! As mentioned, this is a little recognized or appreciated way of reducing a debt ratio, but the fact is most countries grow debt far, far faster than GDP. So, with these three things we just outlined, Spain has seen a seemingly miraculous improvement in its debt ratios. Then the Spanish economy grew at more than triple the Eurozone average in 2024. In the fourth quarter of 2024, Spain's growth was 0.8%, while France's was negative 0.1%, and Germany's was negative 0.2%. So there you have it, and this is a formula that could work in other countries too. Unfortunately for Spain and a lot of other countries, really, perhaps even the entire world, Donald Trump's rapid-fire, crazed, and illogical tariff policy, I believe he's made over 90 changes to tariffs just in the last few weeks, will probably bring an end to Spain's favorable run. That's it for this week.